Hey everybody, welcome to Conversations with Jackie and Bobby. My name is Jackie Angel. I'm one of your hosts, and today I am joined by author Julia Sadusky, who has written the amazing book, Start Talking to Your Kids About Sex, A Practical Guide for Catholics, and Talking with Your Teen About Sex, A Practical Guide for Catholics. Welcome, Julia.
Hi, it's so good to be with you, Jackie.
Hey, so I was giving a talk about two teenagers at a high school, and then I had to give a talk to parents about kind of this topic. And so we had endorsed your book for the Start Talking to Your Kids About Sex. And then I got on Kindle. I was like, I'm going to get the one for teens, right? Because we have kids that are 10 and under, but I just wanted to make sure, I had all the language, and I've learn stuff from the organization, the Birds and the Bees, and they're really good about empowering parents about how to talk to your kids about all this stuff, and the parent should be the expert. But your books, I feel like, did such a good job kind of just putting all the information in there. And what I love what you did so much was you gave scripts for how do you say this to your kid? But before we get ahead of ourselves, I would love for you to introduce yourself. Tell us a little bit about yourself because people may not have ever heard of you. So first, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, so my name's Julia Sadusky. I'm a licensed psychologist in Colorado. So I've been out here since about 2019. I grew up on the East Coast and went to Ave Maria University for undergrad and was raised Catholic and still Catholic. And it's a big part of my life and my passion for my work, and went to grad school in Virginia. I kind of knew from a young age I wanted to be a psychologist, and that doesn't always happen for people. So it was a real gift to just have that direction from God that this was what I was going to do. And so I've worked in a lot of different contexts. I worked right out of college in a rehab for substance abuse in Naples, Florida. And then I went to grad school and did a lot of work with teens and their families. And so that's where a lot of the insights from the teen book comes from, is just over the years working with teenagers, trying to coach their parents. And I would say that these books really were an effort to be proactive about things that I talk a lot about in therapy, things that I respond to in the aftermath of, and trying to think, how do we equip Catholic parents to be the primary educators of their kids when we all agree that that's best case scenario? But when I looked out in what's available for parents, even to just refer my clients to say, hey, here's a book that I trust and would recommend. A lot of the resourcing either was from a secular perspective and maybe had some good insights, but around things like pornography and masturbation would be missing a lot of really important pieces, or from a Catholic perspective, were more about how to teach theology or apologetics around sexuality, but not so much how do we psychologically attend to what's happening developmentally from an integrated lens. So that's really where these books came from, is trying to do that more effectively.
Yeah, and I love that you have two books, because the first book is it's all age appropriate for the younger group. And I think the first book, it was for under 13 or under 10, right?
Under
you kind
10,
of wrote it
that's
for that
right,
crowd. Yeah. And I love that you kind of start the book with, the talk is not enough, right? We used to say, when are you going to give the talk? But can you talk to us a little bit about why that's kind of an outdated way of seeing it? Not just giving the talk when you're 10 or 12, 13, but what is the better approach than giving just one talk one time?
Yeah. Well, you mentioned, that used to be kind of the thing that parents would joke about and talk about. And I think we carry that in our generation as well, that this is kind of how you do it. You wait till they're 10, 11, 12, and then you have one talk about menstruation and pubertal changes and sexual intercourse all at once. And, I don't know that the talk was ever enough, but I certainly can tell you that the way in which social media and just technology has shifted in so marked, in the last 15, 20, 30 years, that the way that we parent today has to be responsive to access to technology. And there's been such an inundation in media of sexual content, and that's true for kids younger and younger, that they're having access to devices where they're, even just a typo on a Google search can lead to early exposure to really inappropriate and damaging content for kids. And so it was striking to me that as I sat with clients who were talking about harm that happened in childhood, again, whether that was early exposure to pornography or unwanted sexual experiences, sexual abuse, all of that was happening well before the age of 10. And so by the time 10, 11, 12, 13, you're having this first conversation about all things sexuality, your child has gotten an education, and a poor one, from just about everywhere you wouldn't want them to get an education from. And then it was no wonder to me that by the time Catholic parents are trying to then convey Catholic sexual ethics to their kids in the teenage years around sexual intercourse and pornography and masturbation, it's too late at that point. And in that way, a talk can't possibly account for all those other ways that sexuality is impacted and sexual development is impacted by our current climate and current culture. And so that's really a big piece of it. The other piece of it is, of course, most people in their teenage years are not sexually active. And so then the question becomes, while I'm not having sex, what does it look like to be developing into a healthy sexual being as an adult? And what type of formation do people need to learn boundaries, to learn assertiveness, to learn the things that are really essential when it comes to healthy sexual functioning in your life? And how do we identify sooner when things are going awry? And so that's really the spirit of the book, is saying there's so many topics that comprise to sexual education that maybe we haven't realized we have to be attending to. And it can make that sex talk way easier when you've been having these incremental conversations.
And I think what sometimes parents don't realize is kids are getting an education, whether you're teaching them stuff or not. They're getting an education from somewhere. They're either getting an education by you not talking about it, and so they can sense, kids are so smart, they can sense the shame. Like if you know, even when it comes to words like vagina or penis, right, which we should be able to say without shame, they can sense like, oh, mom gets really weird when she says that word, or when I say that word, they can see that, but they're also getting an education from a lot of times pornography or from their friends. And so as parents, we should be the expert, the ones who are the first educator of our children. And so why do you think it's so difficult for parents? And I know you share this in the book and it's so good. Like why are parents so afraid to have these conversations with their kids?
Yeah. So as a therapist, of course, I hear from parents all the time who will say to me, I really want to have this conversation. And we may even talk through, all right, let's have this conversation. Here's what you can say. They come back the next week. I didn't have the conversation. And you start to get curious about what is getting in the way. What is it that makes there be such a gap between my intention and then my action to have the hard conversations with my kids? And I think there's a couple of things that I map in the book. The first being lack of role models. If we didn't have any role models and what we did see was avoidance or making light and using humor to deflect and avoid those conversations, or sometimes I've heard, Catholic couples get married and then a parent calls 5 years later and says, hey, how is sex going? I know we never talked about that. So, right. I mean, the lack of modeling about how to effectively, calmly, and with medical language talk about things like genitalia in candid ways as a biological reality that's worth knowing about. We don't have role models for that. And that in and of itself makes it really challenging. There are other pieces too, though. I think we know theologically and we know just from understanding human nature that we carry shame after the fall. And shame impacts the sexual realm. It impacts how we relate to our very bodies. And so shame can make it difficult because it feels like I'm doing something wrong or being something bad when I acknowledge the reality of being a sexual being, and increasingly with how sexualized our culture has become, I think in the church, we've tried to appropriately say we reject that. We don't want to sexualize ourselves and others. And in doing so, maybe have overcompensated by avoiding conversations that are really essential and authentically Catholic to be having. And then the final piece that I think has a pretty profound impact is unwanted sexual experiences when you yourself as a parent, and I'm sure some listeners can relate to this, have your own experience of abuse or harm in the sexual realm, or maybe your parents talked about it too much and too explicitly, and you don't want to be that and don't want to do that, that can lead to an avoidance of this conversation to try to avoid what was done to you or overexposing your kids too young. And so really finding a path forward that's balanced is hard when you don't have the role models and have your own history to contend with, even without being fully aware of it.
Right. And I've heard parents say, oh, if I talk to my kid about sex, they'll become sexually active. Or if we talk to our daughter about her cycle and we teach her how to chart her cycle, she's going to become sexually active. And I'm like, oh my gosh, those are two separate things. Like almost people have a fear that knowing about sex is going to create very unhealthy like desires when actually it's the opposite. When we come from a place of fear and shame, that actually has worse consequences for the kids because like you said in your book too, like it then creates an outlet or there's almost more of a curiosity and those kids will want to seek that information somewhere else. So you're right, like while the culture is very far one way when it comes to the body and sex, we have to find this middle way of the beauty of the body and talking about it without shame, without fear. And one of the things that you do so well in the first book is a lot of the first book is being very open with your kids about their body parts, especially because of safety issues and boundaries and trusting other people. And after reading your book, I kind of made sure my kids, because I have two older daughters who I've had a lot of conversations with, and I have two younger, and then I have a baby, but I have two younger that I'm like, oh shoot, I have to make sure I have talked to these kids, the little ones. And so like I came home and I was like, okay, just making sure you all know, like no one touches your penis or vagina. These are good and beautiful. Like, and we don't touch anyone else.
That's right.
But can you talk to that, like the importance of making sure we talk to our kids about this in regards to even safety, abuse, and because a lot of your first book deals with that and having family rules and stuff. So can you share some of what you think are the most important things for if parents are watching this who have little kids, the most important things they should know?
Right. Yes, you bring up such a great point that the connecting point for parents is not just about healthy sexual functioning in adulthood, which is wonderful, but it's deeper than that. It's about a fundamental safety in embodiment and safety in your environment. And so there's so many conversations that lay a foundation for healthy sexual functioning that have actually little to do with that. It can feel like why are we teaching a 3-year-old the word penis or vagina? And grandparents will come over and be scandalized. Like, what are you doing? Why would I say that word? Right? Because generationally that wasn't done. Well, the reason for that, which may surprise some listeners, is that the number one thing that protects against sexual abuse in childhood is a child knowing the accurate medical terminology for their genitalia, which can shock people. Like, why? How does that make a difference? It shocked me when I first heard that. I thought, are you sure that makes that big of a difference? And here's why. When you have an unwanted sexual touch or an encounter in childhood that's abusive in nature, or even not abusive, but, kids might be playing doctor and might touch a part of the body that is private. If a child doesn't know what that part of the body is called, it's a lot harder for them to communicate to mom and dad, here's what happened to me. Especially if that was an experience where they felt bad or guilty in it happening to them, like maybe I did something wrong, it becomes even more difficult to use your verbal abilities to say, here's what's going on. Whereas if a child gets hit in the arm, they'll come tell mom and dad because it was my arm and I can talk about that with you. And so for parents to show that ability to not just initiate those conversations, but then receive information about those parts of the body, if there's infection, something like that, as well, it makes a huge difference in opening those lines of communication in that pre-verbal and then early verbal age. And so that is a piece of the puzzle. Another piece being, though, that people who perpetrate harm are more likely to use nicknames. And so then if somebody is using a nickname and teaching your child a nickname for a part of their body, almost by form of, grooming them, you can identify that way sooner because you start to hear them talk about, hey, where'd you learn that word? Because that's not how we talk about that part of the body. And so it lets you be able to anticipate those things. And then if, God forbid, something does happen to your child, they have the linguistic ability to come to you rather quickly, actually, and say, hey, so-and-so, touched me in my penis. They grabbed it, or, whatever it is. And that's how you start to buffer against the long-term impacts of abuse, because the abuse is harmful. But we find that the post-traumatic stress of abuse is actually just as caused by what happens in the aftermath of it. Who supports you? How do they help you process? And so that's a really fundamental piece of that conversation. But you mentioned other things, right? Like family rules, setting a framework for the fact that we don't keep secrets in our family. And so if somebody was to ask you to keep a secret, that's not something that we do in our home. That way you can start to, again, buffer against some of the typical behaviors we've learned from research, put kids in harm's way. Thinking through sleepovers. A lot of parents, there's so much to think about these days, especially, and it's so overwhelming. And so just trying to map and be intentional about, what do we think about sleepovers? How do we want to approach that? Is that an off limits thing for our family? Is that on limits with certain people? And just inviting people to think that through, because I continue to learn all the time about the common places where harm happens to kids. And if we can start to anticipate those and provide some education for our children, hey, if this scenario was to happen, here's how you could respond. And here's who you would come to. You would come to me. And here's our plan for that. Those are some of the things that we talk about in the book. And then a last thing being a common question, do we make our kids hug strangers that they don't know, but we know? Grandma comes and they don't remember grandma, but do we make them hug her, sit on her lap? What type of autonomy do kids get to have at that early age? And it's really hard to appreciate until we get older and you start to hear from adults about boundaries and what's so hard about that. And talk about this in the book, that it is really difficult to learn boundaries when you're an adult. It's so much easier if you learn how to say yes and no, and to communicate discomfort from a young age. And parents are so instrumental in teaching that, or teaching, unfortunately and unintentionally usually, that it's not polite to say no. And so we want to teach our kids there are times where you can communicate yes and no, and expect that to be honored by people, even when it's inconvenient, which boundaries, if we're honest, can be quite inconvenient sometimes.
Yeah. And I think being a child of the 90s, we were taught stranger danger, right? Like, oh, beware of strangers. But truthfully, and this is because I've had to sit through the amount of safe environments for every diocese that I've had to sit through. Like, so I watch this all the time about grooming and people who, are perpetrators of abuse. And is that most of the time it's people we know, and it's not strangers.
Yes.
I mean, it's a huge percentage of the time it's people we know, whether it's relatives, coaches, teachers, people we trust. And so I love that in the book you said, we don't trust somebody just by the fact that they exist. Like, they don't earn our trust just because they exist. Like someone has to earn our trust. And you actually share, there are different things, like questions to ask of, why should I trust this person? And so, and I love that you even give examples, like, what are things that break trust? Like if they ask your kids to keep secrets. And there's a difference between, I even like this, like the surprises. Like a surprise has an end date to it, right? Like we can have surprises, and we're going to surprise dad for his birthday or something, versus like, this is a secret, because most of the time, abusers will, or someone who's grooming your kid will say, oh, don't tell mom and dad. Like this is our little secret, right? And so I think that's so important that you mention that. And you're right. It is so hard sometimes to have family rules, and that it's really hard to try to let other people in on your family rules, because you're thinking like, oh gosh, I feel so ridiculous having to tell this person these are our rules. How do you think parents, because even though I don't like conflict, and I've had to get better at being like, no, like these are our family rules. And not just to pawn it off on my children to say that, but like, what
That's
can
right.
you share with parents? Like, how can parents be better about just kind of sticking up for the rules of their house? Like, for instance, like, we're like, if you come into our house, like even other family members, cousins, like you can't have your phone on you that has the internet, because our kids are little. And, if we have older cousins or something that have a phone with internet, we have rules like you can't be on your phone, because we know, Bobby and I know, working with teens, and he worked at an all boys Catholic high school. I have worked with teens for 20 years. I know that porn is a click away. And I know,
Yes.
again, what you said, an innocent Google search gone wrong. Whew. So like, what can you say to parents just maybe to encourage them to be like hold strong when it comes to their family rules?
Yeah. Well, you have to anticipate how terrible it's going to feel, especially if those of us were taught that, being charitable, being kind, being polite is kind of like the best and most important thing. And really we combine charity with politeness, right? If somebody's pleased by me, then I know, right, I'm being kind and loving. When really, when we start to set boundaries, we find out quickly that people who are benefiting from our lack of boundaries, or who would benefit from those lack of boundaries, will usually not be satisfied when we set healthy boundaries. And I think we have to anticipate that and in some ways own it. So you mentioned I can feel like really awkward or like I'm initiating conflict. And I often tell parents, say that. When you talk with somebody, say, I feel so awkward even saying this, or I feel like a stick in the mud. And this is so important that it's worth being a stick in the mud about. And we have to connect it to something really grounded in our values, that this is that important that I'm willing to be uncomfortable. I am willing to look like a kind of too serious parent or over the top or helicopter parent. Like I'm willing to take that risk for the sake of my child, because I can tell you, Jackie, that when I talk with adults who have been harmed, the number one thing they wish is that their parents had been willing and had the skills to step into these moments with courage and confidence. And you can do it before you're confident. And that's the really wonderful thing about it, is you don't have to feel sure of yourself. You don't have to feel even totally convinced that you're making the best decision, even though you are, right? And so you can say, I feel really terrible about this, or I feel really guilty even having to ask for this. And this is so important to our family. And people who are going to be in our inner circle are people who respect this. And if we can't find an agreement, and if it feels like it's not something you can commit to, that's okay. We can kind of make adjustments in how often we see each other, or the proximity that we'll have because of that. And that's not out of a place of punishment or out of a place of resentment. It's just being honest. Here are the rules of the game. And this is not just a game, it's about the safety of children and generationally the impact of harm and protecting against that in our homes and in our Catholic families. It's worth fighting for. And I know many parents, yes, very awkward right away. And then you start to identify people who can meet you there and who can respect those things. And many other parents are relieved, because then they get to have the opportunity to assert, hey, here's where our family's at, and here's what's important to us. And so it really invites people into a healthier dynamic.
Okay, thank you. That was so great. And like, speaking of awkward, what do you do what can you share with parents? Like, what do you do when you find your kid looking at pornography, or you find your kids playing doctor with another kid? Like, and you say this in the book, and you do such an amazing job. Like, I love it. But share with parents, like, what do you do when you find, and you're in those awkward situations where you find your kid doing those kind of things? What do you do as a parent?
Yes. So I want to parse out for people, we can have such a strong emotional reaction to the playing of doctor, or I hear so many stories of this, of just, I walked in at a play date, my kids are playing in the other room, and they both have their pants off. Like, what is going on? And it can feel as if you're walking in and they're viewing pornography. Now, playing doctor is a developmentally typical engagement that a child will have with their body and other people's bodies. Why? Because kids learn through their senses. So just like they touch everything in the house that you don't want them to touch, they touch every part of their body as they're exploring it. And they sometimes will touch other people's bodies, your body, their body, other people's. And so being able to expect that, number one, and know that that is a normative behavior that we have to engage with. So listeners, don't hear me say normal and think by that I mean so you don't do anything about it. A normal, like throwing food on the floor as a baby, is normal. We still teach our kids to keep the food on the table, right? And so in the same way, when we see a child, and let's take the example of a play date and your kids are in the back room, doors open, you know, you're checking in regularly and you come in and both of them have their pants off and you say as calmly as you can, what are you guys doing? Or if you can't ask a question calmly, then you might just describe what you see. Oh, I noticed both of you have your pants off. Tell me about that. So you're just describing so that you don't over respond in that moment. And if you're not in a position to respond calmly, which is very normal, it's very activating when that happens. The first thing you do is you make a direction, right? Hey guys, we wear our pants when we're playing. So everybody put your pants on, and you wait for everybody to put their pants on. And you say, you know, we don't play games like taking off your pants in our house. Then you leave the room. You communicate with the other parent. Hey, here's what happened. And then you can kind of process it with that parent, with your spouse. Come down from, oh, I hate that happened and I'm so scared and I feel so guilty. I should have texted sooner, all those things. And then you come back to your kid at a time when they're calm and you're calm. Because the moment of danger has been attended to by your intervention, right? You've had them put their pants on, and that is not in and itself a traumatizing experience for little kids of the same age or around the same age to do something like that, right? So then you come back to your kid, and again, you narrate, and do a lot of this in the book. Just narrate what you saw. Hey, I noticed that when I walked in, you had your pants off. Tell me about that. You get the kid talking. Now, kids can usually tell that they did something wrong, right? So they may be quiet. They may say, I don't remember it. And you expect that. But then you tell them, what were you doing that for? Sometimes when we're curious about our bodies, we look at our bodies or we look at other people's bodies. Do you think that had something to do with it? And they'll probably say, yeah, because that's usually why it's happening, is they're curious. And then you say, of course, you want to learn about your body. And as your parent, our job is to help you learn about your body. And so we're happy to keep doing that. And we're going to teach you. And these are those body parts. And we're going to talk you through that ongoing. And if you have questions, you can come back to us. But people's bodies aren't a toy to be played with. And neither are our bodies. And they're really lovely and beautiful and wonderful. But they're not to be put on display. They're not to be just looked at and touched. And so we have a rule in our family, and that's where you teach the rule, right? That this is something that we don't play with. And so the only people allowed to see your naked body are your parents when they're showering you, bathing you, all of that, and a doctor when mom and dad are present. Outside of that, we don't show people our private parts, and we don't. If somebody was to show us or ask that, you can always come back to mom and dad, and we'll help you figure out what to do.
Yeah, I love that you find every opportunity to have conversations with your kid, like, or tell people, like, every opportunity or everything is an opportunity. And for me, as like a former youth minister, and I still work in ministry, like, I love these conversations with my kids. Like, every chance, I'm like, let's, you know, every single opportunity, I'm like, let's talk about the goodness of our faith or the goodness of our bodies. And, you know, like when I was pregnant with my last baby, my 5-year-old boy said, how does the baby come out? You know? And so again, having learned, like, you're the expert, it's not again. And I was like, well, right now the baby is in my uterus. And then the baby when the baby's ready comes down the birth canal and comes out my vagina. And then here's baby. And he goes, oh, okay. You know, it's like no big deal. Right. And so like, oh, okay. And yeah. And even with my own kids, just, you find them playing with themselves and their private parts, and you say, okay, your penis is good or your vagina is good, but we don't play with them. They're not toys to play with, But if you ever are hurting there or you ever have a problem, like you come tell me and I'll help you. So I think it's so great that even in your book, like, and I want you to share too, like if you find them looking at pornography, to even make that an opportunity to share the beauty of the body. So can you share kind of what you said in the book about if you find your kid looking at pornography?
Yeah. So with pornography, I mean, again, it's so emotional for parents. I even write, I think, in the book about somebody who was sharing with me, just the thought of that moment is so upsetting, as it should be, because it's so wrong. The access and the intentional targeting, really, of children and trying to get them caught up in something that is so destructive to people's sense of self and sense of personhood. And so it's appropriate to be angry about that, right? The challenge is that usually when parents show that anger, it comes out on their child. And so I often remind parents that if you are walking in on your child viewing pornography, you are in the best position to help your child. It's when you don't know that you can't do anything to help. And the people who suffer the most are the people who suffer in isolation. I mean, it's hard enough to be exposed to pornography, which most often happens accidentally. That first exposure and regular exposures can often and most often happen accidentally with children. So we want to anticipate and give our kids the benefit of the doubt that they stumbled upon this at some point. And even if they sought it out the last time, that they stumbled upon this and there was something intrusive about that first exposure. And so, yeah, if you come into a room and you see your child and let's say a 12-year-old and on their computer, you see a video popped up and they minimize it real fast, take a deep breath because in that moment, the most important thing is showing up for your child who's been targeted by terrible content. And that's the way you want to think about it, is how do I help my kid in this moment know, number one, that I see them, I'm grateful, and I want to be the person who knows what's going on in their life, no matter how hard it is to know. And there's nowhere else I'd rather be than with you in the reality of what you're going through. And so if you can, in that moment, to turn towards your kid and sit down next to them and say, hey, I noticed what was just on that screen. Can you tell me about how you came upon that? I know sometimes it's on accidental, sometimes we search for it. How did that come up? And then they might lie, they might tell you the truth. You can't really know that at the moment. And then you just want to get them talking. How long has that been going on? And they might say, oh, it's only one time. Okay. What does it feel like to see that? What does it feel like to have me walk in? Right. And you're just getting them talking. And if they're not in a position to talk because they're totally frozen, then you might just take that as a cue and say, this is really important to me. I'm so grateful that I walked in when I did, because I want to know what's really going on and I can help you with these things. So why don't we take a break? I can tell you're really closed off. And this is a hard conversation. We've never had this happen before. So we'll circle back, let's take a break now and we'll come back together later and come back later. If you can go for a drive or, sit and do something together with kids and teens. We don't want to do face-to-face, just stare downs. It's so anxiety provoking for kids. So finding a way to do something together where you can bring it back up and get really curious about how long it's been there, and continue to build out the sense that these are exactly the things that I want to be present to you within, as much as I don't want to have to navigate something that really is so wrong for kids to be exposed to. And so I talk about that in more detail, but yeah, that's a little bit of that.
Yeah, I would say, and the hope is, as parents, like, we prepare our kids, because it's not necessarily if it's going to happen, it's when it's going to happen. I mean, I know the average age is 11 that a kid is exposed to pornography, which that's the average. And Bobby working in an all boys school, I mean, many of them, it was 8 years old, 9 years old. I've worked with girls and boys. Again, it's getting younger and younger. And even a friend of mine whose kid goes to a Catholic school was like, yeah, a boy shoved his phone in my kid's face, and it was porn, right? Like on the bus or whatever.
Yes.
And so it's not if it's going to happen, it's when it's going to happen. So the hope is that we prep our kids, and there are books like Good Pictures, Bad Pictures, Good Pictures, Bad Pictures Junior, and that just, talking about the beauty of the body, and that we don't ever look at, telling our kids, like, if you ever see a picture where it shows somebody doing this, just come tell mom or dad, and, you won't get in trouble. But I think it's so good that you just create an opportunity out of any of these things. When we see our kids stumbling, because we want the best for our kids. And I love that you say, I think you said this in the second book, that it's never too, like, obviously we want to have these conversations early. Often we're talking about the goodness of the body and sex, but it's never too late. And one of my favorite things that you said, because when I speak to a group of parents, I know some of them have never had these conversations. And so I know they're like, oh shoot, I should have had these conversations. But what you said, and I said, you said, I was like, it's never too late. And you can always say as a parent, because obviously in attachment theory, the repair is so important. And to say, I'm so sorry I never talked to you about this. I'm so sorry I never talked to you about the goodness of sex, because I should have been the one. And for kids to hear their parents admit that they were wrong, or they're sorry, like, I'm sorry I never talked to you about pornography because I should have been the one to talk with you about this. So I love that you in the book say it's never too late to have those conversations, or even apologize that you should have been the one to have those conversations, and they shouldn't have found out from the internet or from their friends or from whatever source it was.
That's right. Well, because so many of these kids, even if they don't show the guilt and shame and self-disgust and self-loathing, they carry enormous responsibility for these experiences, especially first exposures. And so much of my work is reminding them, you were 7 or you were 9 and somebody put this in front of your face at a sleepover or in the car. Help me understand how you're to blame for that. And it helps to have parents take some of the responsibility to say, hey, this is part of this, not all of this, but part of this. It's my responsibility to protect you, not your responsibility as a 7-year-old to know what to do with some of the more horrific imagery that we can conjure up. It's just such a big ask. And I often remind parents that nobody comes to therapy and says, I need to talk about this thing that my parent took ownership over, apologized for, and made amends within.
Right.
They never do, because they don't have to, because it's so healing. And so if we can offer a model of this is how you apologized, and this is how you take responsibility, and this is how you make amends and move towards somebody in that, the gift that is to your child is so much better than being a perfect parent. And being a perfect parent is just not possible. So how wonderful that we can be healed in something as seemingly small as an apology and taking ownership.
And that's with anything. I think both in like Restore the Glory podcast and the Place We Find Ourselves podcast, they talk, there are different episodes about attachment theory and how the repair is so important. Like even if the rupture, like, so say I blow up at my kids, it's so beautiful for a kid to see like me, like one of my kids, me saying, I am so sorry I got angry at you. Will you forgive me? Because so many of us never had our parents ever apologize for blowing up at us, right? And so for our kids to see like mom and dad aren't perfect, and it's okay, like I'm going to mess up too, and that's okay. I think when my kids found out that like I got distracted at mass, they were shocked, like, what? You're not like this perfect angel. I'm like, no, I get distracted too. And I have to, so when they find out mom and dad aren't perfect, I think that's so healing for a kid to know that we struggle as well and we're not perfect. One of my favorite things that you talk about in both books, so you talk about how do we talk about the LGBT stuff? How do we talk about the transgender stuff? And the thing that I thought was so awesome, and I'm totally going to use this and quote you, is the posture or the position and versus the posture. So can you tell the listener, the viewer, what that is when it comes to the teachings of the church? So the position versus the posture.
Yeah. So I first learned that distinction from a colleague of mine who developed Posture Shift. So it's Bill Henson. He developed an organization to try to help train Christian ministries around ministering to people who experience same sex sexuality and gender questioning. And so he was sharing this idea that, how do we, in a world where if we take a certain position on marriage, for instance, or pornography or masturbation, it can feel to people like that position in and of itself is bigoted or hateful or rejecting of people. And so what he says and what I write about in the book is this idea that we can hold a position on something like marriage, and that marriage is a sacrament. It's between one man and one woman for life. It's meant to be unitive and procreative. And that God actually structured that to communicate not just something about who we are, but about who God is. That we can hold that position, and our posture towards people in the world, including people we disagree with, can be really robust and flexible and open in ways that can feel like a stumbling block to people sometimes. Like, wow, you're awfully nice to people you disagree with. What's that all about? Well, isn't that the call of a Christian? And so what I talk about with LGBT experiences is let's say a family, you have a aunt or uncle who's in a same-sex partnership, and your kid's trying to understand, like, wait a second, marriage is between a man and a woman, but uncle so-and-so lives with a man, and what does that mean? And you can say, well, our position on marriage is this and what I just described, and uncle so-and-so doesn't live according to that position. And a lot of people haven't been taught the beauty of that position. And with Uncle So-and-so and with his partner, we can have a posture of openness to them. And you've seen, we have them over for dinner. We get to spend time with them. We get to know them. We get to enjoy. They are really just lovely people in so many ways, and that's our posture. And so it's actually out of our position that we have a posture of engagement with people, including people who don't understand human sexuality in the way that God has planned and God's best for them. And so you're teaching your kids at that younger age why it is that we can reach across the room to somebody out of real, genuine encounter, and do that from a grounded place, not a place of relativism, but actually anchored in our theological and human understanding of the person. And then with teens, we start to teach them a little bit about, as you build relationships, you can pray for opportunities to share about those positions in more detail with people. And it's best shared when somebody's curious about it. And they're not likely to be curious if we're standing outside their house throwing stones at them. I mean, if you're at the kitchen table with somebody, you are likely to be asked a genuine question about how is it that you understand human sexuality. And I think we're training and cultivating real discipleship when we teach some of these things in that way.
Yeah. And I mean, I have prepped my kids going to the store before, like we're shopping for clothes. And I said, listen, because this happens, or even there have been coffee shops where a girl looks like a boy, or you don't know, is this a boy or a girl? And I've talked to my kids, all of them. I said, listen, you might see somebody who maybe looks like a girl, but you don't know, maybe it's a boy, you can't tell. I said, so, we believe that even if someone dresses like a girl, but they're a boy, they're still a boy. And my kids are like, oh, well, yeah. Because, I'm like,
Sure.
just because someone dresses like a boy, does that make them a boy? No, it doesn't. They know that. And I said, but we smile at the person. We love them. You can say hi. Again, that posture of love. Like, I'm just like, how would Jesus encounter somebody? So I love that you have that distinction of position versus posture, because you can hold the position that the church teaches and still have a posture of love, to still have a posture of people know you love them and that you can still smile at them and say hi. And kids, yeah, and I feel like for the kids to know that, because obviously even in my family, we have people who don't practice the same things we practice, and in a lot of things. And for me to be able to say, well, this person believes this, but we still can love them, and we love them as a human being and a person. And so, yeah, I love that distinction. All right. So I would love to talk a little bit more about your second book, Talking with Your Teen About Sex, and specifically about puberty, and then even talking with your kid about sex in the early teens and the late teens, kind of how we can have those conversations differ. So when it comes to talking about puberty, what age do you normally, I mean, obviously I would say before it happens, but ideally, what age would you say is good for parents to start talking with their sons or daughters about puberty?
Yeah, so probably between, 8 and 10, 8 and 11 at the latest. I mean, in some families, people are late bloomers, so you can kind of expect kids to experience puberty a little bit later. But once you start to see any manner of hair growth or breast budding in girls, or more frequent erections in boys, you start to get the sense the body's starting to vote, and it's starting to communicate that it's going to develop in these ways. And so it's best to communicate that as early as possible. So I think 8 to 10 is a safe time to do that. People are experiencing puberty younger and younger. So that might sound young to people, and it is younger than it's ever been. And there could be lots of reasons for that, but ultimately 8 to 10 is when we want to start that. And I think you want to start forecasting what's happening and why. There's going to be changes that you're going to notice in yourself and you're going to notice in your friends. For boys, these are the things that starts to happen. Hair growth, you start to notice more muscular growth. You start to notice that your genital area will start to grow hair. You'll start to notice more frequent erections, and we can talk about what that is, that's blood flowing to that region of the body. You may even notice something called ejaculation, or a wet dream, where when you're sleeping, your semen will come out of your penis, and that's normal, and we can help you clean up after that and wash your sheets, right? Like, you're kind of teaching and mapping that with young girls. Hey, you're going to start to notice that, your body's going to change in certain ways. Your hips are going to get a little bit wider. Your breasts are going to start to develop. You're going to get to learn how to shave, which is something that, we start to learn as we get older. Hygiene becomes more important, and acne will start to happen. And all of that is because your body's growing just like it has at every other time. And it's actually its way of working. And then we introduce menstruation for girls. And again, a normal biological process that tells you your body is working. Mm-hmm. It's when you're not menstruating, it's when you're not experiencing any erections, that we start to get concerned. Something's not quite right as you get older. And so you start to help your kids prepare for that. You get, young girls a kit together of, what can I have on me if I start my first period? Because otherwise it can be quite unnerving and emotionally.
Right. You start bleeding, so you think you're dying.
Yes.
Right.
Yes. So it's just being able to really help prepare, and then they can have questions for you. And why do I bleed? And if you've told them about the uterus, that's quite easy to talk about at that age. And so anyway, that's kind of the puberty area is really just locating for themselves and their peers' bodies. And one last piece of this, because I've done a lot of work in eating disorders, is teaching kids at this age that body comments are not appropriate. So people's bodies are not for public commentary, which means that talking about a girl's breast developing or a guy, if he has a spontaneous erection, is not something we do. People's bodies are their bodies, and they're not a show. And again, you just start to teach that the dignity of the human body at a time when kids can be quite mean to one another when it comes to these changes. So you're teaching your kids how to be different in the world in that way. And then sexual intercourse is, I like that you're splitting that up too, about just there's different ages where there's kind of the short form and long form. That first age, maybe once we get to 11 to 13, they're in that early puberty stage. If they haven't asked you already, which they may, I mean, kids as young as 5 can say, "What's sex?" if they hear about it or see it on a billboard or something. I've heard people benefit from, with a really young child, saying sex is male and female, man and woman, that there are two sexes, man and woman, and there's other meanings of sex, and we can talk about those as you grow up. And then as they get a little older, once you've taught them about body changes and shown them even diagrams of this is the male reproductive system and female reproductive system, that next conversation, it becomes quite simple because you're just putting the two together, which is the beauty of how God created it. And actually the way that we participate, right, in new life is the penis and the vagina are coming together in this way. And I'm showing you how that works in a diagram. And it's the way that God intended for married couples to participate in the gift of life and to be united to one another and make a total gift of themselves and to be totally received by the other. And so that's probably, the most you have to do, bare bones, with a kid of that younger age range, early teenager. But you want to use medical language in the ways you described earlier, because you want your child in some ways to have it go over their head and feel like, wow, my parent knows a lot about this, a lot more than me, because it cues them to come back, right? Like, oh, okay, so they know way more, so I can come back to them. And you want them to know more from you than they would get from a peer. And then you invite that, as we get older, kids will start talking more about this. Kids may ask, have you had sex? Do you know what sex is? And you can tell people, that's kind of a weird thing to ask you about because it's really none of their business. And we can talk about the questions that come up with your friends because they will talk about it. And when they do, there's nowhere else I'd rather you go than to me. As they get a little bit older, they're going to be hearing probably about some friends who are sexually active. They're going to start to connect that not everybody waits till marriage to have sex. And some kids will be dating. And as they get older and in that dating realm, I am really passionate about this. We can talk about chastity and the value of waiting, but we also have to help teenagers know the things that they can do and not do to make that really likely that they could refrain from sexual activity. Coaching them on the sexual response cycle is really important as they get into those late teens, that what is orgasm and that there's a point of inevitability for that. And so even if you're not having sexual intercourse, you can experience orgasm through stimulation. And do we know that? Do kids, as they get older and are in a romantic relationship, know that that can happen and know what boundaries to put in place in their romantic encounters to prevent stimulation that will be arousing for them in ways that unintentionally can push them down a trajectory that can be really confusing? And so these are the things with later teens that I would want to introduce more, along with boundaries around sexual touch. We're learning more and more about just how high the rate of sexual assault is leading up to college and into college. And a lot of times it's happening with romantic partners where it feels like, well, I like you and I don't mind kissing you, but it kind of got away from us in a way that I didn't feel comfortable. And you want to help prepare your teens as they get older, 18, 19, 20, that I can like somebody and not like everything they do. And I can find it difficult in certain moments to say stop because I feel frozen or scared. And let's talk about what happens if that does happen in your life and in your relationships. What do you do next? And how do we coach you through that? And again, these are all things that in a perfect world, we wouldn't even have to talk about. But in a broken world that we find ourselves in, it's so good to equip your kids and teens to be ready for the world as it is, and to be able to know where to turn if things go awry.
Yeah, so good. So good. I mean, even just the fact that they watch TV shows and all that stuff, like my kids were watching Into the Spider-Verse, and the first one, or maybe Across the Into the Spider-Verse, and he talks about he's like, is this puberty? And my 8-year-old, 8 and 6-year-old, they were like, what's puberty? And I said, well, it's when a boy becomes a man and a girl becomes a woman. They're like, oh, and I just said, when hair grows here, and then they, when they see me after a shower, they go like, what's that? And I said, well, that's what happens in puberty. They're like, I don't want to go through puberty. So, but I think even it's funny because those create conversations and just like dripping little things a little at a time is so good. And that it's certain things are normal and good. And like what you said, like even about, I had some college girls ask me about like the study they heard that if like men don't masturbate, they're going to get testicular cancer. And I'm like, oh my gosh, if that were true, every celibate priest would have testicular cancer. Like, are you kidding me? Because the body releases that. Men release
That's
if
right.
they don't masturbate, guess what? Their body releases the sperm naturally through a wet dream, which by the way, I did not learn until I was married. And my husband,
That's right.
like, again, like it's so crazy. We don't learn this stuff. I also will say, if anyone's listening to this, having kids in public school or private school is going to be very different than homeschool because you are going to have these conversations much earlier when your
Yes.
kids are in school versus when they're homeschooled. Now, granted, I will say too, friends of mine who have homeschooled and have multiple siblings, these talks have to get younger and younger if you have more siblings because the siblings are like, Mom, Dad, you need to talk to our sibling about this because we're, like they're asking questions younger age or whatever it is.
Yes, that's
But
right.
I remember, I mean, I was in eighth grade. Eighth grade when I heard my friends talking about like certain things, I'm like, what's that? Or they're talking about oral sex or anal, and I'm like, I don't know what that is. And it's because when you're in
Right.
public school, your friends are educating you.
Right.
And so my thing is middle school is very interesting because I speak about chastity to middle schoolers and high schoolers. Middle school is weird because you have kids who are sixth graders who have no clue about anything. And then you have kids who are in eighth grade who are pregnant. I mean, and
Yes.
it's just such a widespread. So I generally
Yes.
have a much different approach to middle school. But high school, I'm like, listen, parents, if you have not talked to your kids at this point, they're learning from their friends. They're learning everything from their friends. So oh
Yes.
my gosh, by high school for sure, we need to have these conversations with our kids. And kind
Yes.
of what you said, affirm the good. These things are normal, they're good. Our desires are good. Orgasm is good. Like this stuff, and obviously that's later teens, but we shouldn't, for
Yes.
parents to have fear or shame. I think the good, like the thing, what you talk about your book too, is like kind of this parents, if we have that going on in ourselves, we kind of need to look like, what's our story been? Why is it that we have that fear and that shame about talking about this stuff? And we are afraid to talk about the body parts and all that stuff.
Right. Yeah, it's so helpful to even take 10 minutes as a parent. And this is really in the teen book. I do more of this, but what is my own sexual story? What are the messages that I got and I took away about human sexuality? Because try as I might, if I can't acknowledge that, sit with that, and even share about that with my spouse or with a therapist or with a close friend, spiritual director, or all of the above, it does come out sideways and we can be well intentioned and send a message we don't want to send. And so being able to take a few minutes to just say, yeah, what's been impactful to me and how might that show up is going to be really helpful because golly, our kids need our help in this area now as much as ever before. And as you can see, as we're talking, there are so many facets to it and so many nuances based on your own particular family and your own children and their personalities and what they're needing from you. But you can't talk too much about normal, natural human experiences and emotions. And sexuality is part of the way we were created by God. And it's a very fundamental aspect of our personhood. And to be good stewards of it, we really do need to be taught, much like we do with any other virtue, like chastity.
Yeah. Is there anything else before we go that you want to share about the books or anything we didn't say that you're like, oh, I really wish I wanted to say this? So is there any last word you want to get in about any of this stuff?
Yeah, I think we hit on it in some ways already, but just for those listening who are, as you said, listening and thinking, I haven't done any of this. Number one, yes, go back to and I even map this in this teen book, go back to your child or your teen and say, hey, you may not have noticed or you may have noticed, but I've noticed that I haven't talked with you about sexuality. I'm sorry. I'm guessing there are some impacts from that. What has that been like for you? and see if they'll share anything. And then commit with them to doing some of the things, even pick one thing, one chapter. And if all you do before your teenager goes off to college is teach them accurate terms for their genitalia and teach them what to do if somebody touches them in an inappropriate way, you have done more than generations of parents have done. Mm. And so I just want to encourage people listening that everything is of great value that you put in and invest in your child, no matter how small it feels to you. None of this is perfect. And the whole point is that we can have these conversations ongoingly, and it really is never too late. I'm learning, as an adult about human sexuality in ways I wasn't taught as a child. You mentioned things you've learned in marriage. And all we want to do is continue to build out ways to buffer against harm and cultivate healthy sexual functioning. And we can do that at any point in our development.
Yeah, that's beautiful. I think that these books empower parents so much, and you literally give scripts to say, this is exactly what you could say. So I think you have done such an amazing job compiling so much information. So, okay, I'll show this one. This is Start Talking to Your Kids About Sex. And then you have the other one because mine's on Kindle. So can you show?
I have the teen one. Yes, this is Talking with Your Teen About
Sex. Yeah, and
sex.
they can find them either on Ave Maria Press or Amazon, right? Awesome.
Correct.
And Dr. Julia Sadusky, right?
Yeah, that's right.
And so, thank you so much. I'm so glad you are empowering parents. Again, so many of us we weren't given the tools. And so we want to give our kids the tools, and you are giving us the tools to give our kids the tools. So I'm so grateful for you. And again, the fact that you are you love your Catholic faith. You are in line with the Catholic. All of this it's so good. So thank you so much for what you do. And where else can people find you or follow you?
Yeah, so I have a website, which is easy enough. It's my first and last name.com. So people can find, upcoming speaking projects that I'm working on, new books, and a whole resources section for all things mental health and sexuality. I put some of my favorite resources on that website. I have an Instagram page, which is the best way to kind of follow along with what I'm doing day to day, week to week with some of the speaking I do on these topics. And so if I'm ever in people's areas, they can find me through my Instagram page, which we'll put in the show notes. And then people can always email me through my website if you have questions or could benefit from some support along the way.
Thank you so much. I could talk about this all day. So
fun to talk
through
with
every
you.
chapter because I love this kind of stuff, and again, the youth minister in me with now having my own kids, I love talking to my kids, and it's so beautiful when your kids are of the age of reason, and you have these conversations, and they're just so the innocence of kids. It's just beautiful, and that they're curious, and that you can be the one they feel comfortable going to. I trust mom and dad. They know, what you said, they know a lot, man. They know what they're talking about. So I'm just so grateful for you and people who are equipping parents to do this. So thank you so much for coming on the show. And we'll see you all next time. Thank you guys for watching, for listening, and we will see you next time.